Have you ever wondered why a man who once held you with unshakable intensity suddenly grows quiet, distant, almost unreachable, right after you've shared your most intimate closeness? Most women assume passion cools because desire has died, but the truth is far more complex. What you think drives him away may, in fact, be the very force that binds him closer, if only you learn to read the unconscious language beneath his silence. Carl Jung believed that intimacy awakens the archetypal shadows buried within the psyche, and today this is more relevant than ever. When a man pulls away after intimacy, it is rarely about the woman's worth or attractiveness. It is not about the softness of her skin or the words she whispered in the dark. It is about what intimacy awakens inside him. The closeness of flesh often stirs ancient fears, the loss of individuality, the weight of responsibility, the confrontation with his own vulnerability. In that moment after union, the masculine psyche is no longer only physical, it is existential. He is forced to face what most men are taught to suppress, the fear of being engulfed, the terror of dependence, the realization that love can undo the illusion of control. To pull away is not always to reject, it is, paradoxically, to protect the fragile scaffolding of his inner world. The archetype at play here is not simply the lover, but the wanderer, the eternal seeker who fears being trapped. After passion, the wanderer wakes within him and whispers, "Do not stay too close, or you will be consumed." You may think his silence is personal. You may replay every detail, your body, your words, your gestures, as if the distance were a verdict against you. But in truth, what you are seeing is a man wrestling with his own unconscious, his shadow pressing against the walls of his carefully constructed persona. He withdraws not because you are too much, but because the intimacy revealed too much of him. And here lies the paradox for the woman. The feminine psyche often reads closeness as safety, as the opening of the heart, as proof of devotion. For her, intimacy is expansion, she melts into it. But for him, intimacy can sometimes feel like a mirror held up to his soul, a mirror he is not ready to look into. This is the polarity of archetypes, the feminine descends deeper, the masculine retreats to regain form. The very difference that creates magnetic attraction also creates friction and pain. And yet, this friction is where transformation lives. Carl Jung wrote of the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men, the inner masculine in women. Intimacy brings these archetypal forces into collision. When he pulls away, it is his unconscious anima, his denied sensitivity, his suppressed longing, that rises uncomfortably to the surface. He does not know how to hold it, so he escapes. And in that escape, the woman often awakens her animus, the urge to control, to demand, to pursue. This unconscious dance is where relationships collapse or deepen, depending on how it is understood. If you chase, you reinforce his fear of engulfment. If you despair, you feed the wound of abandonment within yourself. But if you pause, if you understand that his withdrawal is not a rejection but a reflection, you begin to shift the entire dynamic. Consider this, the silence after passion is not emptiness but potential. It is the place where shadows stir, where the ego trembles, where love confronts fear. Most women react as though this space must be filled, with words, with reassurance, with pursuit. But what if you allowed the silence to breathe? What if you saw his retreat not as the end of intimacy, but as the necessary pause for his psyche to reorganize? Power lies not in clinging, but in holding presence without fear. To embody this is to step into the archetype of the queen, rooted, magnetic, sovereign, unafraid of distance because she knows her essence does not vanish in another's absence. Intimacy is not only a meeting of bodies but a collision of unconscious worlds, and the aftermath of such a collision is rarely tranquil. When a man pulls away, what you are witnessing is the psyche's attempt to regulate a sudden flood of archetypal energy. Jung understood this as the tension of opposites. The more one pole awakens, the more its shadow counterpart rises to balance it. After closeness, vulnerability stirs. Vulnerability calls forth fear. Fear calls forth distance. And so he retreats, not as an act of cruelty, but as a reflex of survival. In those quiet hours when his warmth is replaced by absence, you may feel abandoned, unseen, left to cradle your own longing. Yet it is crucial to understand that the feminine wound often projects itself here. For many women, shaped by both culture and early attachment, his withdrawal strikes at an old scar, the fear of being left, of not being chosen, of being too much or not enough. The unconscious whispers, "This is proof that love always fades. This is proof you are disposable." But these whispers are not truth, they are echoes of your own shadow, waiting to be met with awareness. The man's retreat does not define you, it reveals you. Look deeper, and you will see that this cycle is ancient, woven into myths and symbols. The hero who journeys out after union, the warrior who vanishes after passion, the wanderer who cannot stay too long in one place, these are not modern accidents but archetypal stories etched into the masculine psyche. To expect him to dissolve this pattern instantly is to deny the depth of the collective unconscious. But to recognize it is to reclaim your power. You are not the abandoned maiden in his story unless you choose to play her. You can also be the sovereign figure who knows that her worth is not diminished by another's absence. This is why desperation weakens the bond, while stillness strengthens it. When you chase after him, demanding answers or reassurance, you amplify his unconscious fear of being consumed. To his psyche, pursuit feels like entrapment. But when you hold your ground, when you meet his absence with presence rather than panic, you embody the archetype of containment. You become the vessel that does not shatter when touched by silence. In that stillness, he begins to sense not a woman clinging to him, but a woman rooted in herself. And paradoxically, it is that rootedness that pulls him back more powerfully than any demand could. There is also a modern layer to this ancient dynamic. Today's man lives in a culture that rewards detachment, stoicism, achievement, and the suppression of emotional depth. For him, intimacy is not only about you, it is about his lifelong conditioning meeting its first real test. When he withdraws, it is often because the emotions you awaken threaten to unravel the armor he has been told to wear since childhood. He fears losing himself. He fears becoming dependent. He fears that desire makes him weak. In truth, these fears are illusions, but they feel real inside his nervous system. And so he steps away, not realizing that it is the very intimacy he resists that could heal him. For the woman, the key lies in shadow work, turning inward rather than outward when his distance triggers you. Instead of rushing to prove your value, you face the parts of yourself that fear abandonment. Instead of begging for closeness, you integrate the voice inside that equates silence with rejection. Each time you resist the urge to chase, you are not only breaking a relational cycle, you are reclaiming the exiled parts of your own soul. This is individuation, the process Jung described, becoming whole by uniting conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, longing and strength. His retreat becomes your initiation. So when you feel him slipping away, do not fall into the trap of believing it is proof of your unworthiness. See it instead as a mirror. The distance that follows intimacy is often misunderstood as the collapse of desire, when in truth it is the crucible where transformation is forged. Think of it not as a void, but as a threshold, one that reveals the unspoken laws of attraction, the hidden forces shaping both man and woman beyond their conscious awareness. In those moments of silence, the masculine is not abandoning the feminine, he is wrestling with the weight of what intimacy unveils. Desire stripped bare becomes frightening, because it points not just to the pleasure of the body, but to the surrender of the soul. And surrender is the one thing the ego resists with every fiber of its being. The masculine psyche, trained to prize autonomy and mastery, often recoils when faced with the vulnerability intimacy demands. To him, closeness awakens the archetype of dissolution, the fear of losing his boundaries, of being absorbed into another, of ceasing to exist as a sovereign self. He may not articulate it, but his body and mind enact it, stepping back, withdrawing into solitude, creating a distance where he can reassert his identity. This withdrawal is not betrayal, it is the psyche's attempt to restore equilibrium. For the woman who feels abandoned, the danger lies in personalizing what is, in fact, archetypal. Yet the feminine psyche is no passive victim in this dance. Her own unconscious is stirred by his retreat. She is confronted by the shadow of abandonment, the old wound that whispers she is not enough to hold his devotion. This is where the archetypal polarity intensifies. She yearns for union, he fears engulfment. She leans in, he steps back. It is a cycle that can spiral into despair, or be transmuted into awakening. The choice lies in how she interprets the space between them. If she succumbs to fear, she becomes the pursuer, the controller, the one who grasps for assurance. But this pursuit only confirms his unconscious fear, driving him further into withdrawal. Yet if she holds still, if she embodies the archetype of the sovereign feminine, steady and self-contained, she disrupts the pattern. She becomes the mirror he cannot escape, the silent presence that calls him back, not by demand, but by magnetism. This is the paradox, the less she chases, the more he is compelled to return. Not because she is playing a game, but because her presence becomes a sanctuary rather than a trap. Jung taught that what we resist in others is often what we suppress within ourselves. When a man resists intimacy, it is not the woman he resists, it is his own anima, the tenderness, dependency, and emotional openness he has buried. And when a woman resists his distance, it is not the man she fears losing, it is her own forgotten wholeness, the parts of herself she has placed entirely in his hands. Both are projections, both are invitations for shadow work. If either can pause and reflect, intimacy transforms from a battlefield into an initiation. The Stoics spoke of a more fatty, loving one's fate, embracing what comes not with resistance but with clarity. In love, this means accepting that withdrawal, silence, and distance are part of the rhythm. The night follows the day, exhale follows inhale, retreat follows union. To resist this cycle is to suffer endlessly. But to accept it with dignity is to enter a higher form of intimacy, one not built on constant reassurance, but on trust in the deeper currents of the psyche. When you understand this, his withdrawal no longer threatens you. It becomes a space you can inhabit without fear, a pause where your own sovereignty grows. The woman who learns this truth ceases to panic when he steps back. She does not claw at his silence, nor does she collapse into despair. Instead, she turns inward, tending to her own shadows, meeting the abandoned child within, reclaiming her power piece by piece. And as she does, she becomes the embodiment of wholeness. The silence after closeness is not a void to be feared, but a mirror revealing truths that words cannot hold. When a man pulls away, it is not the end of the story, it is the chapter where the unconscious speaks in gestures rather than declarations. His retreat is the language of the archetype, and to understand it is to stop confusing instinct with rejection. In this space, the woman is invited to step beyond the realm of reaction into the deeper realm of recognition. The question is never, why does he not want me, but rather, what does his absence awaken within me? For many women, the emptiness that follows intimacy resonates with the earliest imprints of attachment. The nervous system remembers, the unavailable father, the inconsistent caregiver, the unhealed scars of being unseen. And so his distance becomes a trigger, pulling up layers of shadow long buried beneath performance, beauty, and striving. It is here that the true danger lies, not in his withdrawal, but in the meaning she attaches to it. She thinks it confirms her unworthiness, when in reality it is exposing the wound that longs to be healed. This is why shadow work is essential. Until she confronts the inner child who fears abandonment, every man's distance will feel like a betrayal. For him, the retreat is less about her and more about himself. After passion, the masculine is confronted with the quiet terror of exposure. His ego has been breached, the walls he built to protect his autonomy tremble. He senses, perhaps unconsciously, that the union touched something beyond flesh. It pierced the armor of his persona, threatened to dissolve the illusion that he is invulnerable, self-sufficient, and in control. To a man unprepared for that depth, the instinct is not to move closer but to step back, to rebuild the fortress. He withdraws not because she failed, but because the intimacy succeeded in reaching the very place he does not yet know how to inhabit. This polarity, her longing for closeness and his instinct for distance, is not a curse but a design. It is the friction that generates growth, the alchemy that forces both into deeper confrontation with themselves. If she can hold her ground without collapsing, she becomes not the abandoned lover but the sovereign witness. If he can face his vulnerability without fleeing, he becomes not the vanishing wanderer but the man who returns with greater presence. Together, the cycle of union and retreat becomes the dance of individuation, where both are refined by the fire of unconscious forces. But such transformation requires a radical shift in perspective. Instead of seeking validation in his nearness, the woman learns to find power in her stillness. Instead of interpreting his absence as proof of rejection, she begins to see it as the terrain where her own self-worth is tested. And instead of chasing, she allows space to speak for her. This is not manipulation, it is alignment with archetypal truth. The more she embodies the essence of the rooted feminine, the one who does not beg, the one who does not panic, the one who does not fracture, the more magnetic she becomes. Her presence itself becomes the gravitational field that pulls him back, not through demand, but through inevitability. The greatest paradox is this: the intimacy he flees is the very intimacy he desires. Beneath his retreat lies longing, and beneath her longing lies fear. When both confront these shadows, the cycle no longer enslaves them. It becomes the crucible where connection deepens. She learns that her worth is not defined by his pursuit. He learns that his vulnerability is not his enemy but his path to wholeness. And in that recognition, intimacy ceases to be a battlefield of needs and becomes an arena of transformation. So the next time silence follows passion, the pull of absence after intimacy is like the tide withdrawing from the shore. It feels like loss, yet it is also the very movement that prepares the next return. In this ebb, the masculine psyche is attempting to reclaim a sense of separateness, to gather the fragments of self that union temporarily dissolved. To him, distance restores identity. To her, distance feels like rejection. And in this polarity lies both the greatest suffering and the greatest opportunity for growth. The woman who misinterprets his retreat as abandonment often reacts from a wound rather than wisdom. She rushes to close the gap, chasing him with questions, seeking reassurance, demanding the proof of devotion. But what she does not see is that her pursuit mirrors his own unconscious fear, the fear of being consumed. In her chase, she becomes the engulfing force his psyche already dreads, and so he withdraws further. The cycle deepens, leaving both trapped in a dance of projection. She sees her unworthiness, he sees his loss of freedom. Neither sees the truth, that intimacy is not destroyed by space, but tested and tempered by it. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the path toward wholeness, the integration of the unconscious into conscious life. In love, individuation demands that both partners face what intimacy awakens in them. For him, it is the anima, the suppressed tenderness, the emotional vulnerability, the need for connection he has learned to deny. For her, it is the animus, the drive to control, to command, to hold power when she feels powerless. Each is confronted by their shadow, and each must decide whether to collapse into it or to integrate it. If they fail, the relationship becomes a battlefield of unmet needs. If they succeed, the relationship becomes a vessel for transformation. This is why stillness is power. When he pulls away, and she does not chase, she steps out of the archetype of the abandoned maiden and into the archetype of the sovereign queen. Her worth is not diminished by his absence, because she knows her value is not dependent on proximity. She does not demand, she allows. She does not plead, she holds. And in her holding, she disrupts the unconscious cycle. He begins to sense not a woman who clings, but a woman who radiates. This radiance is not performance, it is the natural emanation of self-worth. And paradoxically, it is this very presence that draws him back. The masculine, too, is changed by this dance. When she does not chase, he is forced to confront his own shadow. Without the distraction of her pursuit, he cannot project the role of the consuming force onto her. He must sit with his own vulnerability, his own fear of dissolution. And in that confrontation, he begins to realize that intimacy does not destroy him, it reveals him. It does not take his freedom, it awakens his humanity. When he returns, it is not out of guilt or obligation, but out of choice. And choice is the essence of true desire. In modern psychology, this cycle is mirrored in attachment theory. The anxious clings, the avoidant retreats, and both become locked in a loop that perpetuates their deepest fears. But through awareness, this loop can be broken. The anxious learns to self-soothe, to find safety within rather than chasing it without. The avoidant learns to stay present with discomfort, to allow vulnerability rather than fleeing from it. In this meeting point, intimacy deepens. It is no longer about filling wounds with another's presence, but about healing wounds in the presence of another. The retreat of the masculine after intimacy is not the end of desire but the continuation of its rhythm, a pause in the eternal dance between closeness and distance. Like the moon pulling back the tide, his withdrawal is not permanent absence but part of a greater cycle. Yet because the feminine psyche often experiences union as safety, his silence lands like a wound. She feels suddenly unmoored, left holding an intimacy that seems now unreciprocated. But here lies the deeper lesson: what feels like abandonment may, in truth, be initiation. When she can resist the urge to collapse into panic, the woman begins to perceive the archetypal undercurrents shaping his behavior. The masculine is often raised to equate intimacy with vulnerability, and vulnerability with weakness. To him, union can feel like exposure, the stripping away of the persona he has carefully curated for survival. Jung spoke of the persona as the mask the ego wears to navigate the world. After intimacy, that mask slips. He glimpses the raw self beneath, the tender anima that has been long exiled. The instinct to withdraw is not born of indifference but of fear, the fear that closeness has unveiled more of him than he knows how to hold. At the same time, her own animus rises in reaction. The voice that demands, that wants to chase, that insists he explain himself is not the voice of her essence, it is the shadow of control, activated by the fear of losing love. If she succumbs, she acts out the very energy that drives him further away. But if she can remain, breathing into the silence, she awakens a different archetype, not the abandoned maiden, not the demanding pursuer, but the sovereign feminine who knows her worth is unshaken by another's absence. This sovereignty is not coldness, it is radiance without grasping. And radiance is irresistible. The polarity is necessary. Without distance, there is no return. Without absence, presence loses meaning. The suffering arises only when absence is mistaken for rejection. Yet when the cycle is understood, intimacy deepens, because both man and woman are invited to meet their shadows with awareness rather than reaction. He is asked to face the fear that intimacy dissolves him. She is asked to face the wound that silence diminishes her. In doing so, both move closer to individuation, the wholeness Jung described as the union of conscious and unconscious. The Stoics, too, remind us that suffering is born not from events but from interpretations. His silence is not suffering in itself, it is the meaning she attaches to it that wounds her. If she interprets it as proof of her inadequacy, she will crumble. If she sees it as his unconscious seeking balance, she will remain steady. In this steadiness lies her power. She becomes the unmoved center around which his restless energy turns. He senses, perhaps without words, that she is not trying to bind him, not trying to rescue herself through his presence. And it is precisely this freedom that draws him back, not because he must, but because he chooses. Modern trauma psychology echoes this wisdom. The nervous system seeks safety, and safety is found not in constant closeness but in regulated presence. When she calms her own system rather than demanding he regulate it for her, she breaks the cycle of dependency. She becomes self-sourced, whole within herself. In turn, he feels space to confront his own fear without being overwhelmed by hers. Intimacy becomes not the merging of two incomplete beings, but the meeting of two sovereign souls. So the next time the space that follows intimacy is not a punishment but a portal, a threshold where hidden patterns emerge and the unconscious is laid bare. To see it clearly, one must strip away the illusions of modern romance, where closeness is mistaken for permanence and silence for rejection. In truth, this interval after passion is the most honest moment of all, for it reveals not what is performed but what is concealed. The masculine psyche, retreating into distance, is not turning away from her but returning to himself. The feminine psyche, aching for closeness, is not merely longing for him but for her own lost wholeness reflected through his presence. Each projects, each misunderstands, until awareness breaks the cycle. What frightens him is not the woman's body, nor even her devotion, but the confrontation with his own anima, the hidden feminine within him that union awakens. In her touch, he feels tenderness he has been trained to deny. In her gaze, he senses dependency he has been told to fear. In her presence, he encounters the possibility of surrender, and surrender threatens the illusion of control on which his persona stands. To flee is easier than to face the unraveling. He does not articulate this, he may not even know it. But the psyche knows, and the body acts, stepping back into silence as a shield against dissolution. For her, the danger is projection. She sees his distance not as his struggle, but as her failure. Her animus awakens, whispering that she must do something, explain, correct, control, demand. Yet every attempt to fix the distance becomes fuel for it. He feels pursued, and the fear of engulfment tightens its grip. What she does not see is that her worth is not diminished by his absence. The very belief that it is the shadow that must be brought into light. To sit in silence without collapse, to remain radiant without pursuit, is her initiation. This is not passivity, it is sovereignty. The archetypes teach us that every withdrawal holds the seed of return. The wanderer who departs is also the hero who comes back transformed. But he cannot return freely if shackled by demand. He must feel the absence as space, not as accusation. When the woman embodies stillness, she creates that space, and in it his fear begins to soften. He sees not a force trying to claim him, but a sanctuary where he can rest. This is the paradox: the less she chases, the more he seeks her. Not because she manipulates, but because her presence becomes gravity itself. Modern psychology mirrors these archetypal truths. Attachment wounds replay themselves in this dance, the anxious fearing loss, the avoidant fearing engulfment. But the healing is possible only when each turns inward. The anxious learns to hold herself, to become the mother she longs for. The avoidant learns to sit with vulnerability, to stay when every instinct screams to run. In this way, relationship becomes the alchemy of individuation, where each is forced to confront the parts of self long disowned. Love ceases to be about filling each other's emptiness, and becomes instead about expanding into wholeness together. So when he pulls away, remember, you are standing at a threshold, not a dead end. The silence is an invitation, not a rejection. It asks you, will you abandon yourself in his absence, or will you remain, whole and unshaken, within your own essence? The choice defines not only the relationship but your path to sovereignty. To see absence as a mirror rather than a verdict is to step into the rarest form of power, a power that does not grasp, does not plead, does not fracture. The aftermath of intimacy is where many stories collapse, not because love has ended, but because the unconscious begins to speak in a language few have learned to hear. Distance arrives, silence takes root, and the woman often believes the narrative of abandonment. Yet beneath the surface, something else is happening. The masculine is grappling with exposure, the raw, unguarded self that intimacy tore from the depths. He is not leaving her, he is fleeing from himself, from the tenderness he does not yet know how to inhabit. His retreat is not about her weakness but about his shadow, and the sooner this truth is understood, the sooner the cycle can be transmuted. In myth, the hero always departs after union. The wanderer leaves the hearth, the warrior leaves the beloved, the seeker leaves the temple. This pattern is not personal, it is archetypal. He leaves to reclaim his identity, to find himself again after merging too deeply. The woman who takes his leaving as proof of rejection misses the deeper law at work: closeness dissolves boundaries, and retreat restores them. The cycle itself is natural, what matters is how each responds. If she collapses, the wound of abandonment deepens. If she chases, the fear of engulfment intensifies. But if she remains still, rooted in her own radiance, the pattern is disrupted, and intimacy evolves. Stillness does not mean indifference. It is the stillness of a flame that does not waver when the wind changes. It is the stillness of a queen who knows her throne is not shaken by another's absence. This kind of presence does not need to demand or beg, because it is already complete. And it is precisely this completeness that reawakens his desire, drawing him back not out of guilt or habit but out of recognition. The masculine is magnetized by sovereignty, he senses safety in her wholeness. Where neediness repels, radiance calls him home. From the lens of psychology, this cycle reflects the deep interplay of attachment wounds. The anxious clings, convinced that silence means loss. The avoidant retreats, convinced that closeness means captivity. Each is trapped in projection, reenacting childhood imprints with adult partners. But individuation, the path Jung described as integration of self, requires that both awaken. The anxious must meet her inner child and learn that she is safe within herself. The avoidant must meet his shadowed anima, the vulnerability he has denied, and learn that tenderness does not erase freedom. When these shadows are faced, the polarity no longer imprisons, it liberates. This is why the woman's work is not to chase, but to turn inward. Each moment she feels the urge to grasp is an invitation to soothe the part of her that believes love can vanish. Each second she resists the demand for reassurance, she strengthens the archetype of the sovereign feminine within her. Her energy shifts from desperation to magnetism, from fear to power. She becomes less a seeker of validation and more a vessel of presence. And it is this transformation, more than words or effort, that alters the dynamic. For a man who retreats after intimacy, nothing is more irresistible than the woman who does not collapse in his absence. Yet the man, too, is offered initiation. His withdrawal, if reflected upon, reveals the lie that closeness destroys him. In truth, intimacy is not his undoing, it is his awakening. If he can face the discomfort rather than escape it, he discovers that his vulnerability does not rob him of freedom but deepens his humanity. And when he returns, it is not as the wanderer fleeing capture, but as the hero who chooses presence with open eyes. So the silence after passion need not be feared. It is the testing ground of both psyches, the fire where shadows rise and demand integration. When the warmth of intimacy fades into silence, many women feel an ache so sharp it seems to echo through centuries of forgotten wounds. This is not merely about one man stepping back, it is about the awakening of ancient archetypes, the collision of longing and fear that has shaped the human story since time immemorial. His retreat is the stage where her shadow appears, whispering, "You are not enough. You have been left." Yet the truth is subtler. He is not leaving her as much as he is fleeing the mirror she has become. In her closeness, he glimpsed the parts of himself he has long denied, tenderness, dependency, vulnerability, and to see them reflected terrifies him more than her absence ever could. The feminine psyche, however, experiences this retreat differently. For her, intimacy is not an interruption of self but an expansion into connection. She opens, dissolves, merges. When the masculine withdraws, she feels the contraction like abandonment, because her unconscious associates distance with danger. But the Jungian view reveals a paradox: the very space that she fears is also the crucible in which her sovereignty is forged. Without his withdrawal, she might never confront the part of her that has tethered worth to another's presence. Without the silence, she might never discover that her essence remains whole, untouched by absence. This is why the dynamic must not be seen as cruelty but as initiation. Each time he retreats, she has a choice: collapse into fear or rise into self-possession. If she collapses, she feeds the cycle of pursuit and withdrawal, confirming his fear of being engulfed and her fear of being abandoned. But if she rises, she interrupts the unconscious dance. She does not chase. She does not demand. She does not fracture. Instead, she becomes still, like a mountain unmoved by storm, like the flame that does not flicker though the room grows dark. This is not suppression, it is transcendence. In that moment, she embodies the archetype of the sovereign, and from sovereignty flows a power that no man can truly resist. The masculine, too, stands at a threshold. If he only flees, he remains captive to his shadow, mistaking freedom for solitude and intimacy for threat. But if he dares to remain in proximity to his discomfort, he discovers that love does not dissolve him, it refines him. The anima he resists becomes his teacher. His vulnerability, once feared as weakness, emerges as strength. This is the hero's true journey, not conquest of the outer world, but surrender to the inner one. When he returns from retreat, conscious and willing, his presence is deeper, more anchored. He is no longer the wanderer escaping capture, but the man who chooses closeness with eyes unclouded by fear. The cycle of intimacy and withdrawal, then, is not a flaw but a rhythm. Day and night, inhale and exhale, approach and retreat, such polarities define existence itself. The suffering comes not from the rhythm but from misinterpretation. The woman who sees his absence as proof of unworthiness suffers needlessly. The man who sees intimacy as a threat to freedom imprisons himself. But those who see the rhythm for what it is step into a different reality. She becomes radiant without clinging. He becomes vulnerable without losing himself. And together, they begin to move not as captor and captive, but as two sovereign souls orbiting in chosen union. So when silence follows passion, when distance replaces closeness, do not despair. Recognize the archetypal law at work. His retreat is not the end of desire, it is its continuation in another form. Your task is not to chase, but to remain whole. His task is not to vanish, but to return with deeper presence. And in this cycle lies the alchemy of love, the transformation of longing and fear into sovereignty and choice, the metamorphosis of shadow into light. The space that opens after intimacy often feels unbearable because it strips away illusions. In that silence, there are no words to disguise fear, no gestures to cover doubt. What remains is raw, unfiltered truth, the psyche revealing what it has hidden in the shadows. For the woman, it is the ache of abandonment, the inner child crying out, "Do not leave me." For the man, it is the terror of engulfment, the ancient instinct that whispers, "Do not let yourself be consumed." These two shadows meet in the dark, and unless they are recognized, they will continue to reenact the same wound over and over, across lovers, across years, across lifetimes. Yet the paradox is that this very pain carries the seed of liberation. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is not an enemy but a doorway to wholeness. His withdrawal, which stings like rejection, is also a mirror showing her where she has placed her value outside of herself. Her longing, which frightens him as demand, is also a mirror showing him where he has buried his tenderness and called it weakness. When seen through the lens of depth psychology, this dance ceases to be a punishment and becomes a sacred initiation, an alchemical process where both are invited to integrate what they have disowned. The woman who learns this stops giving her power to the cycle. She no longer interprets his absence as a verdict on her desirability. She no longer scrambles to fix, to chase, to prove. Instead, she pauses. She breathes. She holds herself in the very space where she once abandoned herself. This is the turning point, when she becomes the source of her own worth, the silence no longer terrifies her. It becomes a canvas on which her sovereignty is painted. And sovereignty is magnetic. The man senses it even from afar, for nothing unsettles him more, and attracts him more, than a woman who does not collapse in his absence. For the man, the challenge is different but no less profound. His instinct to retreat shields him from the rawness of vulnerability, but it also starves him of the intimacy he secretly craves. If he dares to resist the urge to flee, if he remains in the presence of discomfort, he begins to discover that closeness is not a prison but a path. The anima within him, once feared, becomes his guide toward wholeness. He learns that surrender does not erase freedom, it deepens it. And when he returns from withdrawal with this awareness, his presence is no longer a performance but an offering, no longer fleeting but anchored. This polarity of approach and retreat is not meant to be erased, it is meant to be transcended. Just as the inhale must yield to the exhale, just as day must yield to night, intimacy must yield to distance, and then return renewed. The task is not to resist the cycle but to move through it consciously. When both partners understand this, withdrawal ceases to be a rupture. It becomes a rhythm, a breathing of the bond itself. Her stillness anchors it. His courage expands it. Together they create a love that does not shatter at the first sign of distance but grows deeper because of it. And for the woman, the deepest transformation is this: she realizes she is never truly abandoned if she does not abandon herself. She learns to stand in silence without fear, to embody radiance without need, to hold love without grasping. This is the essence of empowerment, not control over another, but sovereignty within oneself. In that sovereignty, she no longer waits for his return to feel whole. She is whole already. And it is precisely this wholeness that calls him back, not because she needs him, but because her presence awakens in him the desire to choose. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.